Hey, and welcome into the Big Ten Huddle. We appreciate you being here where we cover everything in the Big Ten, every single team. We have another draft recap episode here for you. Going to look more at the data in this one. If you're listening on podcast, don't worry. We'll speak about the data and all that stuff as well. However, these Thursday night episodes, Friday morning episodes, if you get a chance to watch them on YouTube, the visuals definitely help. We have our guy Big Jeff with us with his data insights here once again. Jeff, before we get started, I do have to ask you a question. You ready for this?
I'm ready.
Okay. Who would win in a fight? One Ohio State or 100 Kent States?
I thought you were going to ask me about that gorilla question
Well, you can
going
answer
on.
that too if you want.
So it was 100 versus one, like individuals. Is this Jeremiah Smith is the one? If so, then
Yeah,
I'm taking the Buckeyes
there you go.
or Caleb Downs. Everyone else, I'd go with Kent State. Yeah, that just like a bunch of ants. Pretty hard to beat that many. That many.
For sure. For sure. Well, hey, we appreciate Jeff being here, and we appreciate everybody else being here so far. We got Paul here. He says sup, and he is believing in his Nittany Lions. Looks like Nittany Lions, Penn State national champs 2025, and then Phillipson in the ILL INI. There for you, Philip. I gotta say INI now. I'm writing for Writing Illini, so go check out my work over there on Writing Illini. Also Scarlet and Game, and you can check out Jeff's work at what's the exact URL.
BigJeffsFootball.com. Big
Big
Jeff's
Jeff's
Football.
Foot- BigJeffsFootball.com. Very good. Go check it out. I think I put that in the description. If not, I'll double check and make sure it's in there.
Yeah, it's on my
Um,
moniker here in the
oh yes,
yeah.
there we go. There we go. So, yeah, very excited for this episode. Glad to have everybody here. Everybody else is rolling in now. Hummus Hero saying, "Hey JR and Jeff, we appreciate you being here, Hummus Hero. Got a lot of Ohio State talk for you tonight, Hummus Hero. Don't you worry, don't you worry." Terry says this show takes more shots at Kent State than than the
I haven't
announcers
done it
ever.
once. It's all JR.
I
It's
think it
your
all just
host.
started from Zach covering that one game. That was the very first game he ever got a chance to cover, and it just so happened to be Kent State. So, and Paul's right. The SEC, they're a little beside themselves right now. They still had a very good showing with 79. We'll get to it here in a second, but the Big Ten's closing that gap. First time the Big Ten's ever gotten 70. I think players drafted from what I remember, and it's getting very very close, very close. So Jeff, should we just get straight to the data then?
Yeah, and what's wild is just last Thursday we were right in the draft. It was an hour in, and we were on pick four or whatever, right? I mean that we did our live podcast, and I think it was like 4 hours, wasn't it, JR? How long did that sucker
Yeah, it
last?
was
Cool.
it was about that. Yeah.
Yeah. But, to set the scene here, I'm going to lay out 10 insights on the 2025 NFL draft. Obviously this is mostly Big 10 focused, but we need to compare ourselves to other conferences and especially the SEC to know where we want to be, which is beating the FCC and considered the best conference. And given the last 2 years of national championships, we are definitely closing the gap. And one of the insights touches on that. We're going to go into the numbers. The SEC is still doing very well, but the Big Ten certainly is clearly second in closing that gap. And some of the other conferences not doing so well. So we're going to try to bring you some numbers here to get in it, and then the second half of the insights, we're going to get into all the Big Ten teams and some tables, and we're going to hit on pretty much every one, not in depth, but I do list some winners and losers. Jared, I know you and Zach kind of covered your version of winners and losers, but this is based on data, right? I'm showing you
Yeah.
that. So yeah, let's jump to the first
I
table.
do have one question for you
Yeah.
really fast before we get started. So I assume you saw the show on Sunday night where we talked about it, and I had my take against the SEC. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on that? I am curious because you're a little bit more rational than me and Zach. You will admit it, the SEC is better and stuff like that. Zach and I will too, but very reluctantly, right? I do think there is, an argument though, and just to remind everybody if you weren't there Sunday night, my argument is yes, the SEC had another most draft picks in the draft year. However, they did not have the year of winning in college football that they have before. And so for me, it shows that coaching and stuff like that in the SEC isn't as good as some people think it is. Development in the SEC isn't as good as some people think it is. And so getting more draft picks is nice, but if you're not backing it up on the field in college football, to me, it's like, why have that many draft picks then? So, Jeff, I'm just curious your thoughts before we get into this.
Yeah, I mean, clearly the Big Ten is closing the gap on the field based on the performance we've seen last year in head-to-head matches. The Big Ten fared very well with the SEC. It can be the case where the SEC has a lot of talent, but just maybe not as well-rounded teams as you need to have. So, we see that with like an Iowa in the Big Ten, where you'll see they do really well in overall generating NFL players, but it's not well-rounded, meaning there's certain position groups where they never generate a wide receiver, right? And that's makes them easier to play against because you know what you have to shut down when you're facing Iowa, as an example. So, yeah, JR, I mean, there's no doubt the Big Ten has really good coaches. And the other thing that's common in all these podcasts I've done with this data, the 4 teams that came from the Pac-12 were clearly by far the 4 best teams from the Pac-12, right? And even UCLA, you're going to see, who hasn't performed that great on the field, they generate really a lot of NFL players. They just do way better than you would think. And so I think the potential to overcome the SEC will be driven off of those 4 that we added from the Pac-12, because it's really the cream of the crop. And then the key thing is blue blood programs have to be blue blood programs. The resurgence of the Big Ten in the last 3 or 4 years is due to Michigan and getting their act together, right? And finally supporting Ohio State. So Ohio State isn't the lone wolf, trying to battle and carry the flag for the Big Ten. You had the Penn State doing pretty well and everything. Now we also need USC to be the blue blood that they're supposed to be. And from a recruiting perspective, they're really building some strong momentum. I'm not going to get into that, but they signed another 5-star offensive lineman from Florida today, one of the academy programs. So, JR, always been well coached in the Big Ten, but certainly didn't have the resources to get in the players we needed to really compete. If you have better players with superior coaching, that's a great formula for success.
Totally agree. All right, we'll move on from that since that we hashed that out on the Sunday night episode. Jeff, I'll turn it over to you. You said you had 3 insights to give on these first 2 tables. Go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to give insight here before I get JR and all your comments. Just number 1, the SEC and the Big Ten dominated the draft, and they're really showing they're the kings of college football. But importantly, the gap is only getting larger. So the SEC, and just actually, for those of you who maybe haven't joined us, for the coding, color coding, what it means, in general, if there's a cell in green, that means really favorable data. If it's in that brown, it's like less favorable information. And then in this case, the Big Ten is in the blue row. So the SEC was number 1 in total picks. So that's the first table on top here is total picks going back over the last 10 years. With data, you don't want to look at only 1 year in isolation, right? You want to look at a larger sample size. But focusing on 2025, 79 picks, up from 59 last year. We need to highlight they did add Oklahoma and Texas. So they went from 14 teams to 16. So you would hope that they would grow the number of picks, but all the conferences, the major conferences got bigger, except obviously the Pac-12. So 79 total. And that was a record, but the Big Ten had 71 picks. They were clearly second by far. And we also broke a record for the number of picks. But again, we added 4 teams. So we went from 14 to 18. You would hope you'd break a record when you add, 4 teams, and especially when they're the quality that they are, that I just mentioned. So what's wild is, though, doing the math, 59% of all picks in the draft across the 7 rounds, 59% were either SEC or Big Ten. And that's much higher. We have a column there. What are the last 5 years, the percent of the total? SEC was 25 and some change percent. Big Ten was 20%. So the last 5 years, SEC and Big Ten have been 45% of the total. Well, this year it was 59%. So that's why I'm saying that takeaway. The gap between the Kings, which is the SEC and the Big Ten, and everyone else is getting bigger. The other thing to highlight, the second table below are all the first round picks by conference. And, during that podcast, we were really saying that if the Big Ten got, 9, a lot of mock drafts had the Big Ten projected with about 8 first round picks. So we thought if we got 9, maybe 10, it would be a home run. We ended up with 11, the Big Ten with 11. So that was a great night for the Big Ten. The SEC did have 15 though, right? So, they had the most they ever had. We had the most, Big Ten had the most they ever had. When you combine those two though, 26 of 32 first round picks coming from the SEC and Big Ten. So for those doing math, that is 81%, I believe. Yeah, 81%. So it just really shows the dominance of those two conferences. Now, let me talk to takeaway number 2, and we're going to give a chance here if we cover the first 3 for you guys to comment and JR. Number 2, I should say insight. Schools outside the Power 4, so that's SEC, ACC, Big 12, and Big 12, Big 12 and Big 10, they did much worse than normal, worse than they've ever done. And really, I think their futures look kind of bleak. Let's start with the Pac-12. You only have Washington State and Oregon State. From that row 4 there, they only had 2 picks, so 1 each. That's terrible. I mean, and they had a lot of players leave those 2 programs from the transfer portal. When you look at the other category, that's going to be row 6 in that first table. They had just 33 draft picks in 2025, 33 from all the others. So that includes the Mid-American Conference, Mountain West, et cetera, et cetera. 33 this year. They had 44 last year. Back in 2022, they had 75. Basically, you're seeing the impact of NIL and the transfer portal with those schools. They'll bring in someone, develop them, they show they can play, and they get plucked off by other programs, and it's probably going to be the Big Ten and SEC is first in line to get them. And so that's been a major, impact on college football. That's probably not for the good. It's good for the Big Ten and SEC, but is it good for college football? I'm not so sure. So the third big insight, though, is the ACC and Big 12 continue to weaken. And all of this, you hear some people saying the hypothesis, we're going to be heading toward 2 super conferences, right? And I'm not sure if that's going to happen, but this does provide evidence based on this data, whereas 2 super conferences would make a lot of sense as so many of these other conferences are weakening. So that does support those that believe we're going to have 2 super conferences. The ACC, just to highlight, they had 41 picks in 2025, so that's their third best. But they had 41 last year, but they added 3 teams. So they added 3 teams and stayed the same. You should be going up, right? The Big Ten and SEC went up significantly. ACC stayed the same. That's not good. I can just tell you that. They also only had 2 first-round picks. So you can see that in the second table below, only 2. Big 12 overall, 29 picks in 2025. They had 28 the prior year, but the Big 12 went from 12 teams to 16 teams. They added Arizona State, Arizona, Colorado, and Utah. All right. Well, they had a couple numbers retired from Colorado, so I could probably add a numbers retired column, and give them credit for that, JR, but I'm not going to do that here. That has nothing to do with draft picks, obviously, from the Shedeur Sanders saga. But really, the Big 12 should be growing too. They also, just like the ACC, only had 2 first-round picks. So really, when you add up all those 3, again, Big 12 and SEC dominating, the others kind of falling off, and that leads it to saying, are we headed to 2 super conferences? So I know I covered a lot there, Jared. Let's take your comments. Definitely interested in comments from the audience on the first three insights.
Yeah, I think the ACC and the Big 12 numbers are really revealing of just where college football is at right now with the numbers and the recruiting and what's happening in the sport overall. I do think it was really interesting that literally just last year the Pac-12 had more players drafted than the Big Ten overall. And then you take away, obviously, USC, UCLA, Oregon, Washington, and all the other teams go to the Big 12, and the Big 12 does relatively the same with more teams in their conference. And the ACC as well does the same with more teams in their conference, and the Pac-12 goes down to two. It really does reveal that the Big Ten got the four best programs in the Pac 12 by far, and those programs really did nothing to help the Big 12 and the ACC. And remember, the SEC added two teams as well, so that helps with their numbers going up too. But overall, you can just tell the real winners out of conference realignment. The SEC won for sure, but also the Big Ten won in a lot of ways because not only is USC and Oregon producing talent, but Washington a bit of a sleeper in that, and UCLA also a big sleeper. So I think that was very enlightening from looking at these numbers.
Yeah, just to interject, to that 43 picks in 2024 from the Pac-12. Pac-12 really went out with a bang, and they really had two teams just loaded. Washington, you're going to see in a future table here, Washington had 10 picks in 2024. They had one in 2025. They had a lot of players graduate and then people leave. But, it was a really strong year for the Pac-12 for sure in their last year there.
Philip says, how many draft picks were homegrown versus transfers? I don't think you have those numbers. Do you,
Yeah,
Jeff?
and there's no doubt that these numbers are, someone could say, well, yeah, that player, finished at that SEC school, but they played 2 or 3 years. This data just shows if they finish from that school, that's their school. And in the NFL, they're going to say they got drafted out of that school, right? They're not going to reference anything into the first 2 or 3 years. So, yeah, I don't have that information. That would be really hard to capture all that, but it's certainly reflective here. It's not the case that these players getting drafted here were at that school all 4 or 5 years, right? And that's why this is happening too. Is why it's so tough for these mid-tier programs is just when the kid proves themselves and has that one good year, they're gone, right? They parlay that into getting a payday. Can't blame them for that. I'm not mad at them at all. That's just the nature of it. But we've kind of built that system, and that's why we need better guardrails. We don't mind players leaving and moving up, and as you develop them, but it shouldn't be free agency. It shouldn't be after each year I can go to the highest bidder. It's kind of like the pendulum is swung to the player's favor way too much now. So we need to get it back to somewhere in the middle. That would be
Yeah.
good for college football, right?
Yeah, and things are getting better in college football at that. Right now, college basketball is the one that's really just kind of a free for all every single year, and it's really really crazy. All right, I guess the only other thing I have to point out, and I think you touched on a little bit, just the group of five and the draft picks that we're seeing from there. I mean, they were in the 60s, 70s, 60s. They went down to the 40s, and they went up to 75. Now, of course, that's five conferences combined, but still, 75 for the group of five is impressive. And then ever since then, they've been downhill, and just really speaks to how many of those players are leaving the group of five and getting a bigger opportunity at the Big Ten and the SEC. And I do think that the competition in those two conferences matter as well, right? I mean, you just had the Cardinals talking about the other day. Ohio State not only has some of the best competition in practice, but they have some of the best competition on the field that you see week in and week out. And so you feel more confident drafting those players. I think they were talking about the Big Ten overall there a little bit, but they were primarily talking about Ohio State because they drafted a couple players from there. However, I do think that that plays a factor. You're more likely to be drafted out of the Big Ten and the SEC, not just because of those, the development, the coaching at those schools, but also NFL teams look at that competition and say, we can trust what we see there a whole lot more than maybe what we see against Georgia Southern or Southern Alabama.
Yeah, I was just thinking, I did wonder about that big 75 draft picks for the other category in 2022. I was just thinking, COVID 2021 was way lower than normal with 43 only. That was right when COVID hit. So maybe a lot of those players that, would have graduated or whatever, they were able to hang around another year. So you had a build up of talent more in those mid-tier programs, resulting in that big result in 2022. Maybe that's the explanation for that little bubble there. But in either case, it's really dropped off since then, right? And I think it's just from the transfer portal, NIL just working in a negative way for those programs.
For sure. All right, no other real comments or anything. So if you want to head to the second table, you ready?
Yeah. Well, actually, we're going to stay here. Just the gap. Let's just talk about the Big Ten did close the gap with the SEC in 2025, really powered by Ohio State's 14 picks. But this is the insight. The Big Ten still needs the mid-tier teams to step up more. So I want to look at table one. First of all, the Big Ten only 8 behind the SEC this year in total picks. Last year we were 17 behind, right? So that's pretty big. If you look at table two for the first round picks, 15 versus 11. Again, that's 4 difference, but it really closed the gap from 2024. And a lot of that driven by Ohio State. But I think the good news here is next year, we're going to have all the Penn State players coming in, right? And having a ton of Penn State players getting drafted. So I think that bodes well as we move forward there.
Say Penn State and Illinois and Indiana too, and Washington has some players as well. So some of those teams, Illinois, I don't know how many of those guys will get drafted, but they really stockpiled. And then Indiana has 4 or 5 guys I would say are for sure locks to be drafted. I don't know how high they'll go, but I think they'll for sure be drafted. So
good point. You're going to see that in the Illinois data, how they're going to have a little bubble because they had very few selected this year. It's because they retained so many of their key players, right? And that's why you don't want to overreact to 1 year, right? You want to see a pattern here. I did want to speak to just the 15 picks now unfortunately for JR, to support the SEC strength of the 15 first round picks. They had 8 different schools. I'm sorry. The Big Ten of the 11 first round picks only had 4 schools accounting for those. That's Ohio State with 4, Michigan with 3, Penn State 2, and Oregon with 2. So basically, it's the blue bloods of the Big Ten producing those 11 picks. The SEC, for those 15 picks, it came from 9 different schools. They don't have 9 blue bloods. So that's what I mean. They're mid-tier programs like your South Carolinas of the world, and I would even, maybe you could say Tennessee might be mid-tier, depending on how you look at it. They're contributing more high-level talent than the Big Ten. So if we want to really completely close the gap, we need the mid-tier teams to participate more, especially in the first round, right? In the early rounds of the draft is what I would say. So Jared, go to table 3. Just want to look at kind of like the top 20 teams selected here. So this is kind of cool. This is by school total picks, and all the Big Ten teams are in green. All the SEC teams are in the brownish color. And basically on the left column, it's really listing the top 20. So there's ties here, but Ohio State led the nation with 14. Georgia came second with 13. Texas with 12 was third. Oregon was fourth with 10. Very impressive. And then tied for 6th is Michigan with a bunch of SEC teams. So really, if you look at the top 10 teams, 3 were Big Ten, 6 were SEC. So SEC doing a little better there. If you look at the top 20, it's a little better for the Big Ten, though. In the top 20 teams for total selections in the NFL draft, there were 7 Big Ten teams that made the top 20 and 8 SEC teams, right? So we were only 1 off, JR. So that's good, right? And then you can see on the right all the rest of the teams. I list what place they're in, all the way down to Mississippi State and Northwestern. The only 2 Big Ten and SEC teams that had 0, Mississippi State and Northwestern, by the way. But again, we want to see more green moving up, right? So more green, that it means Big Ten teams in the top 10 would help. And this is where UCLA needs to come through, right? UCLA needs to be there. Penn State probably would be, but again, they had 5 picks, but retained a lot of their talent to make their championship run here in 2025.
Were you saying UCLA or USC?
USC needs to step up. Yeah,
I was gonna say that's the one that I was looking at.
Yeah, USC on here was tied for 25th, so you'll see it later. They're one of the disappointing.
If you're USC, you cannot have the same number of draft picks as Rutgers. I mean,
right.
I don't care what kind of season you have. I don't care if you are, saving players. It can't happen. You need to be above, even if it's just by 1 or 2. You need to be above Rutgers if you're USC. There's too much talent in that state for that to happen.
No doubt. All right, let's get into the Big Ten specific data. Go to table 4, JR.
Okay. I don't think we have any comments on this. I do want to talk about this for a second, if that's okay.
Yep, go ahead.
All right. I just think it's really interesting that you look at teams like Illinois and Washington that I mentioned earlier, Indiana as well. Where are they at? They had 2. Those teams, if they would have just had a few players go into the draft, I think they would have had some more selections, and you would have probably found them either tied for 25th or even above that. And I think that would have helped, the Big Ten's case in a lot of ways. I think, last year you got a lot of comments from people about, the depth of the Big Ten isn't as good as the depth of the SEC. And, you look at the depth of the SEC here, Florida had 7 draft picks. You know who else had 7 draft picks? Miami. And Miami killed Florida, So, Notre Dame only had 6 draft picks, and they made it to the national championship. And you got Florida, who's not even making a bowl game, with their 7 draft picks. Now, obviously, Florida some guys back. It's not exactly a Penn State situation or anything. And their star freshman quarterback only played a handful of games last year. But still, if you're Florida, if you're Billy Napier, if you have that type of talent on your team, and it's one of the reasons why I refuse to rank Florida inside the top 15 until they earn it. And kind of the same thing with Auburn a little bit too. Auburn only had 3 in this, but still, if you're Florida, there's no excuse for having 7 draft picks tied for 4th best in the SEC and not even going to a bowl game. That's pathetic.
Yeah, they had a tough schedule, but you got to still win some games, right?
Yeah.
Despite tough schedule, you still should have at least won a couple more games for sure. So
yeah, and Michigan had a tough schedule, but Michigan still went 7-5 and then won their bowl game, went 8-5. I don't think it was every single game like Florida was. They had a couple cupcakes in their non-conference, and they had a few gimme games in the Big Ten that helped them out at home. But still, yeah, it's just.
Yeah, and I'm going to hit on this. You're going to see it in the next table, but look at Maryland there with 6, and yet they went 4-8. That was one of the things I was going to talk to later. And then I mentioned UCLA, adding them, of the 4 teams added to the Big Ten, UCLA was supposed to be the worst, and yet in certain position groups, they generate some really good players. And have done that consistently over 10 years. This is not a 1-year thing for them, and you'll see that in the next table as well.
All right, let's head on over to it. Table 4, Take it over, Jeff.
Yeah, so the main first insight, Ohio State, the kings of the Big Ten in producing NFL talent, right? No surprise. It's been that way for years. I must say, though, Michigan is not far behind, and their 4-year resurgence has been great for the conference. So that's the insight. Now let's dig in a little more. So Ohio State led all schools with 14 picks. Just so you know, that was 1 behind Georgia, who had the most ever in 2022 with 15 picks. So the 14 was the most ever for Ohio State, and it was one behind the most ever for any program, which was the 2022 national championship team, that nasty defense, half of which is playing for the Eagles, I think, and helped them to the Super Bowl. Have the most Big Ten picks over the last 10 years, too, 85 total picks over 10 years. So just so you know, too, over the last 10 years, only Alabama has more draft picks over 10 years than Ohio State. Alabama had 92, and again, Ohio State had 85. Georgia is third, by the way, with 81. And then this is impressive, and why I say Michigan's not far behind. Michigan is tied for fourth with LSU over the last 10 years in total number of picks across all teams, 73 picks. Now, it speaks to two things. One, the resurgence they've had for the last 3 or 4 years. To dig at them a little more, it speaks to how they really underachieved in Harbaugh's early years. They beat the teams they're supposed to, but they weren't beating Ohio State and Urban Meyer, right? They weren't winning their bowl games. So they were doing well, but they were kind of like Penn State is now, beating all the teams you're supposed to, but not winning the top 10 and top 5 matchups. So, but just from a producing NFL perspective, Michigan is really not that far behind. And if you look at their numbers the last 3 years, 9, 13 last year, and then 7 this year, the 7's a big drop off, but after you win a title, you're going to lose a lot of players. So I have a new color here, JR. I have the purple color, which represents kind of an explanation for why that number might not be as bad as you think. For Michigan, they were coming off a national championship season. For Penn State, the 5 is they retained a lot of players that would have been higher than 5 for sure if some of those guys who definitely would have got drafted would have came out, but they didn't, right? And then, just notable other thing to note too, pretty cool stat. So Ohio State for the 4th straight year had a first-round wide receiver chosen. That's the first time that's ever happened. Emeka Egbuka went number 19 to Tampa Bay. So that's 5 first-round wide receivers in 4 years. So really impressive there. So the second thing I want to talk to is the other 2 biggest Big Ten draft winners were Penn State and Oregon. I list them there because they both had first-round picks. So go to the next table here, JR, I think has first-round picks. Yeah, so just first round, Ohio State and Michigan with 4 and 3, and then Oregon and Penn State with 2 and 2. So, that's part of the 11 there. So I label them as draft winners, especially with someone like an Abdul Carter going 3rd overall to the Giants. That's the highest pick they've had since Saquon Barkley went 2nd in 2018. Of course, they had Tyler Warren. And then Oregon had a couple defensive linemen and offensive linemen go. Go back to the previous one again. So just to speak to Oregon, if you look 10 picks in 2025, that's the most they've ever had. So, and good for 4th best in the nation. So no doubt adding Oregon and having them, act like a blue blood, even though you got to win a national title before I call them a true blue blood, but they're acting like a blue blood when it comes to recruiting and generating NFL talent. And that bodes well for the Big Ten. And then we just talked about the pent up demand for Penn State with only 5 picks next year. It should be a lot higher. So those were the other 2 big winners. I'm going to go into the more mid-tier next, JR, but any comments on those big 4? Any other thing to add?
Yeah, I think, you're seeing, it's very interesting what you're seeing here, because you even look at the 3 years prior to this year for Ohio State. We were talking about how Ohio State was doing really well in the draft, and they did do very, very well under Urban Meyer, 12, 7, 7, 9, and I guess 10 would be more attributed to Urban than it would Ryan Day, even though Ryan Day was coaching that team. I do think the 2020 NFL draft um, was probably more Urban than it was Ryan Day. But still, Ryan Day loaded up that team and had 14 draft picks there in that final season, and probably would have had 15 if it wasn't for Seth McLaughlin getting injured. Of course, he was a transfer, though, so, that just depends on how you want to have those transfer conversations. So, but yeah, I think, Michigan, they didn't really load up on that national championship like Ohio State did. You know, they had 9 and then they had 13. Ohio State had 4 and then they had 14. So just really, really interesting to see how that works. And in my mind, I'm comparing it to Penn State right now and saying, you know, has Penn State been loading up similar to how those two teams were? Well, kinda. I mean, 8-6-8 and now 5. You know, I think you look at the 3 seasons before 6-8-5. That's pretty close to what Ohio State was doing, but not exactly the same. So, but yeah, and then I love what you're doing here with the recruiting ranking next to him as well. Really,
Yeah,
really
average in the Big
disappointing
Ten.
for really disappointing for Nebraska down there. I'm sure you're gonna get into them, but
Yeah, we'll get into
um,
that. And I do think, JR, that the 6 picks for Ohio State only in 2022 and 2023. Remember, that's the year where their defenses were really struggling. I do think the talent level on the defense was down. I think they still were producing good offensive draft picks, as evidenced by the stat we just gave too on the wide receivers. But it was defensively that was holding them back with the 6-6, in my view, I really believe. And that gets back to
right.
having that well-rounded team to win a title. If you've got gaps in position groups, you're only going to be so good, right?
Yeah. And I would say that the transfer portal, kind of did a number on Ohio State there as well. We talk a lot about how the SEC is not nearly as dominant as they once were because, they don't have a bunch of players sitting on their two deep that are future first round picks anymore. Well, the same thing happens with Ohio State in some ways. It doesn't happen necessarily as much now. They just went through the entire the entire spring transfer portal window and didn't lose a single scholarship player, so that's good for them. But they were losing guys in the transfer portal there after the 2021 season and after the 2022 season when Ryan Day was still kind of getting his culture set up and together and stuff like that. And it really shows how much Michigan benefited from that. I know we got Buckeye fans in the chat and they'll point out cheating and all that stuff and everything, and that's fine. I get it. But also at the same time, we also have to give Michigan props. You know, Jim Harbaugh used the transfer portal very effectively. He did a very good job of identifying talent at other places and bringing them in. They weren't necessarily the star players on their team. They weren't necessarily getting Caleb Downs, but they were getting offensive linemen from Virginia that won the Remington Award, and they got the offensive lineman from Northwestern that came in and did a very good job for them. They got the linebacker from Maryland. I guess that was more Sharon Moore this past year, but they've been filling holes a little bit, and even Sharon Moore this year, he's got a cornerback from his team. I think he was from, was it UMass or something like that? And he's been in mock drafts. Jair Hill, he's been in mock drafts to be a first rounder. I don't know if that'll come to fruition or not. That's why they play the games. But it's interesting to see Michigan really benefit from the transfer portal, and I'm not saying that in a negative way. I'm actually commending them for what they were able to do there. And I think Sharon Moore is, I think when he really puts his mind to it, he's doing a good job of continuing that moving forward.
Yeah, I think Michigan's done well of getting transfer portal players that fit their culture well, and they know who they are, right? Power running game, strong defense, for sure. And the other key, the other difference there, 2023 and 2024, beyond all the drafted players, but having an NFL level quarterback, right? Doesn't have to be a first rounder to do well, right? As we learned, the two finalists, Notre Dame and Ohio State, had fifth round picks, but still, fifth round says they're probably a good chance to be on a roster for a while, and that's what matters. It doesn't have to be a superstar, but certainly having that along with a well-rounded team, that's really powerful and could allow you to win a national championship for sure.
Yeah.
So, all right, let's get into
Well,
the.
and
Yeah,
one more thing.
yeah.
I contend if Michigan would have had a quarterback out of the transfer portal that was much better for them last year, which Sharon Moore should have known. That's one of my biggest gripes with him. Like, he was with these quarterbacks. He saw these quarterbacks in practice, and he just willingly went into the season. They kind of went after Talia last year a little bit, but they just willingly went into the season with Alex Orji and what's his name, Tuttle and Davis Warren, and it's like, man, if you just had a Big Ten caliber quarterback, Michigan probably wins 8 or 9 or 10 games next year. They win their bowl game, and they may have taken down Washington in that away game, and they may have taken down Oregon at home too. People forget that game was actually pretty close in the fourth quarter, and then Oregon pulled away. They would have had a
I
quarterback. They would have had a
mean,
shot.
there's no doubt in my mind because let's not forget, almost everyone had Michigan in the preseason top 10. Almost everyone.
Yeah,
Some as high as 4 or 5. I mean,
yeah,
and why not? You saw all the talent. They had the number one probably defensive back, the potential number one tight end, the number one defensive tackle. I mean, they had the number one person at their position across multiple positions, and they knew they weren't going to have the depth they had. They had quarterback question marks, but to lose 5 games was ridiculous. And Jerome Moore's lucky that Ohio State laid an egg and their field goal kicker didn't do his job to at least win that game by 3, which probably should have happened, right?
yeah.
So, and it is a fine line there. If they lose that game to Ohio State, the whole conversation on Michigan is an entirely different thing,
Yeah.
including is like, does Sharon Moore even know what he's doing, right?
Well, and the conversation on Wink Martindale is completely different too. I mean,
Yeah,
fans were not happy with Wink Martindale, and then he
that's
comes
right.
out with that game plan against Ohio State and does a very good job. Talk about Will Howard's concussion all we want, but the game plan was solid, and Texas did that game plan a little bit in their game, and they were able to stop Ohio State for spurts in that one. But I think Ohio State learned from their mistakes. Anyway, we can move on here, Jeff.
All right. So this is insight number 7 here. So beyond that big 4, we have 4 traditional mid-tier teams as draft winners, and I'm going to cover each of these 4: UCLA, Iowa, Maryland, and Minnesota. So UCLA and Iowa, so they're row 7 and 8 there. They have 5 draft picks each. That's tied for 13th in the nation. We kind of showed you that table earlier. And then both these rank, they're in order of 10-year production of NFL prospects. So both UCLA and Iowa rank 7th and 8th. And again, you wouldn't think UCLA would be that high, right? And for those new here, we're assuming all the Pac-12 teams had been in the Big Ten with this table all the 10 prior years in this data, just to keep things simple here. So, UCLA, just impressive what they're doing there. And especially compared to their recruiting rankings, they average UCLA about 11th best in the Big Ten over the last 10 years when it comes to recruiting. And yet they're 7th best in NFL production, right? That means they develop well. I was very similar. I was about 11th as well, 10.9 average recruiting, and yet they're 8th in the Big Ten in NFL production. So that's good coaching, right? That's good coaching through the year. I always had the same coach. UCLA's had several coaches there, but they have been good coaches. Now we'll see if help me out here, Jerry, UCLA coach, Deshaun Foster. We'll see if he, 1 year, you can't judge anyone based on 1 year, really. The next one is Maryland. We talked about them a little. They had 6 picks. That's the most over the last 10 years. So that's impressive. But then you say, why did they go 4 and 8? So we don't want to pile on Mr. Loxley, which I guess we tend to do, but that doesn't speak well to the program from the perspective of what are you doing with the talent you're producing.
I will say, after talking with Larry, it really does sound like last year was one of those years where Mike Loxley just kind of learned what he had to do moving forward. And we've seen that, right? We saw that with Ryan Day. He's still got to learn how to beat Michigan, but still he's kind of learned some of that stuff. I think last year for Sharon Moore was a learning year. Credit to him. He was able to figure it out at the end of the year. I think some coaches, they have that learning year at some point in their career. Now Mike Loxley, maybe that took a little bit longer than what you might think, but with the transfer portal and everything else, happening, that's obviously something to get through as well. And I think it's one of the reasons why I've kind of changed my stance a little bit on being as harsh on some of these coaches. Luke Fickell, I'm a little bit easier on than maybe some other people. Lincoln Riley, I think that I'm going to give him a couple more years before I'm really hard on him because of Chad Bowden and stuff like that. I was always hard on what's his name, Ryan Walters. I was always hard on Ryan Walters. He took too long to learn, but but I do
Yeah.
think for Mike Locksley there was a bit of learning this last year, and we'll see if he did learn and he can implement that. I'm excited to see this year what happens because I think it's going to be
Yeah,
very telling about his
my
coaching.
perspective on Maryland definitely is not it. They should fire
Right. I
Loxley.
wasn't saying you were.
Yeah,
Sorry.
and I know you weren't saying you would recommend, um, but because coaching instability sets a program back a couple of years, and I know that through Indiana, we bounced around with so many different coaches and everything. But this year is really important year. You don't want to have two back-to-back years like where you go under 500. So, but the next one I label winner is Minnesota. They're just steady as can be. So they had 3 picks, and you might be like, geez, 3 picks. Why is that great? But they're just consistent. Won the prior year, but then 3, 4, 2, 5. If you compare the last 5 years to the prior 5 years, PJ Fleck has done well in developing talent, and yet they only have on average the 13th best Big Ten class, and yet they're ranked 11th in NFL production. So they're, developing better than their recruiting. And to me, again, that speaks to good coaching. So I label them as a winner. So let's talk next about insight number 8. Big Ten and NFL draft bottom feeders. Indiana and Rutgers were also winners. So they're the last 2 columns because, again, it's listed in order of over the last 10 years NFL production. But Indiana with 2 might not sound great. 2 draft picks this past year, but the previous 2 years they had 0. And then before that, they had 4 years of 1. So this is 2 is the most they've had since 2018. So I
That was
label
under
that as
Kevin
a
Wilson
win.
too.
Yep.
That was
And
really
as
the last
JR was
time they had
talking
a.
about, that includes a bunch of players like Elijah Strada. If he would have came out, would be drafted for sure. We know that Kamara would be drafted. Not necessarily saying high draft picks. I think the receiver has a better chance to go higher. But still, that's building momentum. That's a good thing. You can use that for recruiting. And then Rutgers with 3 picks. That's the most over the last 11 years. So the prior 2 years was 1 and 1. And over the last 10 years, they haven't had a single year with more than 2. So Rutgers with 3, that's a win. And again, these are really the 2 traditional bottom feeders here for the Big Ten over the last 10 years. Okay, before I go into what I have as the 5 draft losers, JR, any comments on maybe Indiana and Rutgers?
Yeah, I mean, just massive props to Rutgers. It just makes me lament this last season more with all the injuries and everything they had going on because I really do think Rutgers could have had a special season. I think they could have got up to 8 or 9 wins if they didn't have all of those injuries. I mean, we saw when they were starting to get healthy again, the kind of game that they gave to Illinois, and Illinois was one of the best teams in the conference last year for Rutgers to take that game down to the wire. It took a heroic effort from Luke Altmaier and Pat Bryant to be able to win that game there. So there were just some heartbreaking stuff for Rutgers last year, and it's evidence of we don't have very many Rutgers fans watching the channel right now. When Rutgers is good, we get a lot of Rutgers fans, and it's really fun. But when Rutgers isn't so good, they typically stay out of the show, which I don't. We don't rag on them or anything like that. We're very forgiving of Rutgers, but I
I
think
think so. Yeah.
you just don't want to tune in to hear somebody talk about your team losing, which I get that. I get that way sometimes. So, but yeah, Indiana impressive, but overall for Rutgers stinks that they had the season that they had, but that's why you just got to keep recruiting and keep developing year over year.
Yeah, I think Rutgers. I mean, they have the right coach. He's done it before there.
Mm-hmm.
He knows that program, and he knows what it takes to win. And he's no
And he
longer in the
knows New
Big Ten
Jersey
East.
too. Yeah, he knows New Jersey too. That's a big
Yeah,
thing.
yeah. He just needs the right schedule, which he had a good schedule, but then he had the injuries. So, all right. So let's talk about the Big Ten. Also had 5 teams I deem as the draft losers. 5 teams. So first is USC. So USC is in row 6 there because traditionally they've been done really well at generating NFL draft picks, 6th best in the Big Ten traditionally. Only 3 picks, like we talked about, and those picks came in rounds 3, 4, and 7. So no picks in the top 2 rounds. And again, for the Big Ten to be the conference they want to be, they need the blue bloods acting like blue bloods, and then get some help from the mid-tier. That's the key. USC, don't want to be sounding doom and gloom, though. I do think good things are happening from a recruiting perspective. This year, a lot's going to depend on their quarterback. So, but momentum is building at USC because we can't have a 3 spot there from a blue blood program. Wisconsin would be my second loser. They're in row 9. They had 2 draft picks. Last year, they only had 2. If you have to go all the way back to 2016 for them to have as low as 2 draft picks. So this does not speak well to Luke Fickell. Bad results on the field, right? He's under 500. In most Wisconsin new coaches, their first 2 years, they usually do extremely well. So it really kind of highlights the pressure he's under to produce.
How much do you think that it attributes to Paul Chryst, though? I was listening to a Wisconsin podcast the other day, and they were saying they felt like it attributed more to Paul Chryst and his recruiting efforts, and Luke Fickell trying to come in and have a new system that didn't really fit guys, and so now they're going back to. I think there's some truth to that. I think there's also maybe a little bit of wishful thinking as well. I think guys get drafted off of talent and traits sometimes, but which also you have to do a good job of recruiting. So I think it's a much deeper conversation than probably just one take after the question. But I guess you give it your best shot.
Yeah, I think that's total BS. Okay. I think in the world of the transfer portal and how in 1 year you can turn things around like Signetti. So in 2 years, Fickell hasn't figured out how to bring in kids into the program that can get drafted by the NFL. It just doesn't make sense. Their offensive line has fallen off, right? That was their calling card. Their
offensive line was really good last year. They just have some young guys. I think they had 2 guys go to the NFL.
Yeah.
Were those guys drafted?
Yeah, well, and for a while they're having linebackers like crazy, and they didn't have a linebacker really this year. They had Wooler, the safety. So really,
he was drafted as a linebacker. They were saying.
Yeah, I believe that because he's a tough kid. And don't get me wrong, not saying fire Fickell because I do think he is a good coach. He just made a mistake. I like his idea to try something different. Might have wanted to pull the plug earlier on it once it was clear it wasn't working. And now with this new coordinator from Kansas, you only get a second chance once, right? So this is a vital year for them. But I would say, even if their record's not great, what matters most is how they look, how competitive they are. So record matters, but how they look on the field is going to be vitally important.
Yeah, they got to steal one or two of these big games. They got to take down either Ohio State, Oregon, Michigan, Illinois, Indiana. They got to win at least one of those.
Yeah, a top 20 team. Yeah. Michigan State with 1. So Michigan State in row 12, back-to-back years with 1. 2021, they had 0 as well, but that was, I think, Tucker coming in and you kind of had the transition. But D'Antonio had this as a strong development program, had consistent. I mean, heck, in 2016, they had 5 picks. So Jonathan Smith's only been there 1 year. Got to give him a chance, but it's really disappointing. 2 years, 2 draft picks. That's just not good enough, especially a team like Michigan State, who traditionally does have good teams. Northwestern, 0, 2 straight years. 0 draft picks, 2 straight years after 4 in 2023. So not good for David Brown. Northwestern's been impacted by the transfer portal. So, cornerback Benjamin Morrison, who went to Notre Dame, unfortunately got injured and wasn't able to participate in the playoff run they had, but he went in the second round to Tampa Bay. You know, he played his first 2 years at Northwestern, I think was all Big Ten, and they lose him to the portal. So that's what's, that is what's killing them. And that needs to be factored into how we develop, we evaluate David Braun, right? But either way, no one drafted, disappointment. Then 2 that I'm going to kind of say maybe they get a little bit of pass to Washington is in row 5. So surprise, surprise, Washington over the last 10 years have had tied for the 5th most draft picks with USC and UCLA. They only had 1 this past year, but that was after having 10 in their national final year when they lost to Michigan. So a lot of players graduated. They lost a few others. They retained a lot of talent too. I probably could have put them in the purple cell there to say there's a reason for that 1, but I am going to give it a 1 with a caveat there. And then Illinois with 1, also row 13. I gave them in the purple. It's disappointing, but it does speak to how they retained a lot of their talent and should make a run. Some have them in the top 10, I think, maybe a few. They're definitely going to be a top 20 team for sure. But it's interesting, Illinois, average 10-year recruiting ranking of only 15. And Bielema has improved recruiting a little bit, but it's not dramatic, actually. He's just done a good job of knowing how to develop talent, identify, bringing it into their culture, and then making it all work, right? But those are
a talent-rich state too. I mean, Illinois has more talent in it than I think some people give them credit for. Sucks they lost the quarterback, the 2027 quarterback today. A lot of drama there for that. But I know Nebraska fans are happy about
didn't
that.
hear that one, Jared.
Oh, he had a Trey Taylor. He had his commitment today, and he threw the 2 hats, and then he stood up and he put on the Illinois hat, and then he ripped the Illinois hat off and threw it, and then he put on the Nebraska hat and took off his jacket and had a Nebraska shirt on under it. And
that's a good way to do
fans weren't happy.
Burn bridges for teams you're going to play. That really makes a lot of sense.
Well, I almost quoted it and said something like, somebody needs to start advising these kids when it comes to the transfer portal and stuff nowadays. Like, you can't do stuff like that. I mean, I don't think Burt would be that, he would hold that much of a grudge, but maybe he would, I mean, if things don't work out for him at Nebraska and he wants to transfer back home to Illinois, he might have to look at a different school in Illinois. If things go there. I try not to hold against the kid, though. He's just a kid. But yeah, definitely probably needs some better advisors in his life.
For sure.
Yeah.
The only 2 I didn't touch on, Purdue had 1 and Nebraska 2. I didn't put them in a category. Give them, Purdue, give them a pass, given the coaching changes, and then Nebraska 2, not great, but I mean, they haven't had more. In the last 10 years, they've only had 2 years where they had more than 2. So kids make mistakes. That's true. That's true too, Philip.
Jeff Braun was getting these dudes drafted, man. I mean, 2, 2, 3, 5. You
Yeah.
know, I mean, it's not the best numbers in the world, but when you look at the average recruiting rank, 4th, 14th, I mean, that's pretty good. So when Ryan Walters, he still had a few guys on there. Max Clair's going to get drafted after this season. Dylan Thieneman's going to get drafted after this season. He just couldn't put it all together.
That is what Purdue had talent. They had the kid who went to, was it Texas A&M, the guy who led the Big Ten in sacks and then went down. He got drafted early, and so they got hit by the transfer portal in a negative way. Yeah, they definitely had some talent, but again, it wasn't the well-rounded what we've talked about, right?
Yeah,
you got to have all your positions.
This table really does not only NFL draft, but it really does do a good job of speaking to the transfer portal and what teams have really benefited and what teams have really, kind of diminished from it. Purdue, Nebraska, Northwestern, USC. Some of these teams have really, I guess USC was just this year, but still, you should be getting more than 3 or 4 draft picks a year if you're USC for that recruiting rank. So, but teams like Washington, they had 10 draft picks that one year, only one this past year, but they also have a number of guys coming back. They're the one to me, Jeff, that kind of gets unsung a little bit. Everybody talks about Illinois and Indiana bringing guys back, and Illinois and Indiana both deserve to be ranked, but I tell you, if I was doing a top 25, I'd probably have Washington sneakily in there, probably at a 24 or 25. I like Washington this season. I think they can be good.
I mean, they really feel good about that young quarterback and his
Oh,
running
yeah.
ability. So I agree um the running back, and help me out with his name, Coleman.
Jonah Coleman. Yep,
Jonah
Jonah
Coleman.
Coleman.
I mean, really impressed with him. His problem was his offensive line wasn't that good, right? So the question for him is, can they get that line better? But he is really impressive, low to the ground, bowling ball. I wouldn't want to tackle that guy. I'll tell you that. And then
No,
they
they
have
they
some
got
good
star
receivers
power
for
this year.
Washington. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Denzel Boston. I mean, they got star power this year. It's just to me, it's just the line of scrimmages. Can they do enough on the line of scrimmages to let their star power do well? I think they have a lot of depth on their defensive line, but they don't really seem to have a star. And then their offensive line is just very inexperienced. Doesn't mean they can't be good. They're just inexperienced. So we'll see if Jed Fish can get it right.
no doubt, no doubt. Well, I guess
So
final takeaway. So even though I'm a Big Ten fan and supporter, it kind of circles back to maybe the first take for the first insight, if you will. Just kind of saddened to see how unlevel the playing field is for teams outside the SEC and the Big Ten. It's great for us, and it's fun, but for college football, it's not good. They have two conferences just totally dominating everything. Um, I the sport is going to be great no matter what, though. It's just that you know having a more level playing field is more exciting when you've got a chance to make some damage in the playoffs. Although just being able to make a playoffs is a big deal too. So I do feel good about the expansion to 12 teams certainly, but it's going to go up. But I do fear for just a lot of these players, and then the talk of like reducing the number of the limits to rosters to 105. God, talk about a terrible thing. All these players who love football and they're willing to do it without getting a scholarship, and we're just going to take that away from them. It's like, what are we doing? I mean, it so
well, and
uh,
it's like the NC again. This is why the NCAA sucks. I mean, and sorry, I'm going to get on my rant here for a second. They took this to this judge, and this judge is saying, "Hey, maybe cycle them out over the next 4 or 5 years. Don't just cut it and then get rid of kids so they can't be on the teams anymore." And then the NCAA comes back and says, "Well, it's inconvenient for us." Well, guess what? The NCAA, it's not about you. It's about the players. It's about these kids on these teams. More than anything, it's about these walk-ons in this situation where these kids, I mean, they're bleeding, they're cut up, they're bruised every single week, and they do it for the love of the game. They're not getting scholarships, they're not getting big NIL deals or anything like that. They're out there because they love their school, they love the game, they're willing to get beat up by the guys that are 6'5" and 330 pounds, because they love the game that much and they're doing everything they possibly can. So
yeah.
it's just one more reason why the SEC or not the SEC. I mean, they suck too. Don't get me wrong, but the NCAA, why they suck.
Now I know and you and Zach are on that and everything. They do, but it's also the administrators of all the conferences, which they're in concert with the NCAA and all kind of working together and everything. And the NCAA can't do something without the conference's kind of approval and behind it. So all of them kind of suck, actually, right? For not
Well,
being more
yeah, yeah.
proactive and getting ahead of it and everything. But the tip of the spear becomes the NCAA, to your point. So I'm not saying you're wrong, but I'm just saying add in
No, you're
the
adding
conference
context. Yeah, I
commissioner
appreciate
and the
that.
presidents and everything. They haven't been proactive either, right?
Hmm.
Um, but
And
if
part
you're
of it is that the conferences can't get along too. I mean,
yeah,
the NFL really is just one big management system of all 32 teams who get along and say this is what we're going to do for our league. I mean, this is why the SEC has rules like you can't transfer within the conference in between or during the spring portal window. And everybody wants to say free market and there's no rules and it's like Well, there are rules if everybody agrees to it. This is how stuff happens in professional sports and college football and college basketball and all these things could get to these places if you could just get teams and conferences to come together on these things. But the problem is so many different conferences and so many different teams are at different levels. It's amazing conferences can get along, I
Yeah.
mean, and so in most cases they don't. The SEC
Yeah.
is really the only conference that actively works to benefit one another, and it's one of the reasons why you've seen the SEC dominate in football for years until the past couple of years, and then in basketball they dominated this past year because they work together.
Right. Yep. Well,
So
JR, that's my 10. I was hoping we'd be under an hour, but this might be our shortest one, hour and 8 minutes. Not bad. Not
not bad.
bad.
We're doing our best here. I've learned to never say in an episode that we're going to be in under an hour.
No,
It
yeah.
doesn't
I didn't
generally
from the
happen.
start too. I had my hope. But it's hard when especially once you bring up a different topic and everything, and it's good to deep dive it a little bit for sure. And hopefully that adds value to
Yeah.
everyone. So
I do want to do one more thing before we get out of here. Philip, I know, worked very hard on this poem, so I'm going to read his poem to everybody. He doesn't describe it as a poem, I do, but he says, "Fickle has Wisconsin's sickle, and the Badgers Badger fans' tears are at a trickle, but the end of next year, tears will make her their face ripple, quite the pickle." There you go. There's Philip's poem for you. We'll end it with that. Philip, not very pro Wisconsin there. Maybe Philip can write us a pro Illinois poem for next week. So, Jeff, anything else to get to before we get out of here?
no, that's it. So follow me on Twitter X at Big Jeff's FT Ball, and then BigJeffsFootball.com. I haven't been writing articles as much as telling JR I'm closing and buying houses and everything and prepping things, so it's taken away from time for writing articles, but we'll continue for sure to deliver these podcasts, and I'll get back to writing articles as well, but hopefully see everyone next Thursday.
There we go. We'll have another great topic for you. And as Philip says, under an hour against the rules here.
It's the rules.
So there we go.
We don't
There we
like
go.
breaking the rules, so
Yeah, well, no, we're rule followers, that's for sure. So, all right, everybody, appreciate you being here, and we'll see. Well, I'll see you next Sunday. Jeff will see you next Thursday. Have a good one.